the business of renewables, by which I mean the business of developing and then owning and operating solar and wind facilities and selling the electricity that they produce. That business is actually just not a very good business.
Welcome to the New Enlightenment podcast, a production of Adam Smith's Panmure House. I'm your host, Adam Dixon. Today, I'm joined by Brett Christophers. Brett is a professor at Uppsala University in Sweden, but is increasingly, I would argue, becoming a noted public intellectual, regularly producing insightful and critically acclaimed books on contemporary political economy, such as Our Lives in Their Portfolios, Rentier Capitalism, The New Enclosure, and most recently, The Price is Wrong, Why Capitalism Won't Save the Planet. Brett Christophers, welcome.
Lovely to be here. Thanks for having me.
Great. Before we start discussing your book and discussing some political economy, who is Brett Christophers? What is your story? What gets you out of bed every day and motivates you to write, to think, to have something to say about the world?
That's probably the hardest question to start with. I hope they get easier from here. Brett Christophers is a geographer by training, disciplinary training, and by kind of institutional affiliation as well. I've always been in and around geography departments, but I'm not completely a career academic. So I've been an academic most of my career, but I did have a period of about 8 or 9 years, I suppose it was, a while ago now, working in the corporate world, working as a management consultant, a strategy consultant. And the older I get, the more and the more distant I get from that period, the more I realised that it was actually a pretty foundational period for me. Both in the sense of, well, in lots of different senses, but both in terms of it was working in that world that I probably learned most about that world, even though I wasn't necessarily asking the types of questions that I've been asking since, but having that exposure, being within the belly of the beast, so to speak, was very, very important. And then I guess since then, I've carried on asking questions about the business world and the wider world as it's shaped by capital and the state, but predominantly capital. But obviously from a scholarly viewpoint rather than a consultant's viewpoint.
Right.
I wouldn't say that what I do much these days is necessarily kind of what people think of as geography. As you kind of hinted at, it's probably closer to what people think more of as political economy, or what you might just call kind of the critical study of capitalism, by which I mean I'm interested in capitalism, almost everything about it, but I'm interested in thinking about it critically, kind of, testing the claims that it makes about itself as much as anything else.
So what is the geographical aspect, or what does geography do in comparison to other disciplines when studying capitalism and contemporary economics, I would say?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it necessarily does anything specifically differently, but I do think that geographers are, they're not unique in this, but they are by any means, but they are very much focused on understanding capitalism in a very grounded sense, understanding its day-to-day lived realities, not least as it's lived and experienced through kind of built environments, the landscape of social life. And I think that makes it distinctive. Although, as I say, there are plenty of other scholars, not least sociologists, that are interested in kind of the daily lived realities of capitalism. And obviously, of course, geographers are interested in the spatiality, the geography of capitalism, why things happen here rather than there, how what's happened here is connected to what happens there. And then I guess, very importantly, in connection to the latest book I wrote, geographers are obviously very interested in the relation between the environment and social life. So how social life shapes the physical environment, but also how societies are themselves shaped by the natural environments that they inhabit in turn.
So would you say that your experience working as a management consultant, or was it a media consultant? I believe the
it was a
field you were
management
in.
consultant,
Management,
but yeah,
right? Because we've discussed that before, but that I don't like to use the word lived experience because it's quite loaded these days. But that grounded kind of ethnographic, if you like, experience gave you that sense of any of the scholarship that you did have done subsequently needs to be grounded in real life. But the
yeah, no,
criticism,
absolutely.
yeah, but the criticism, or at least I would say potentially the ignorance from the outside, or the criticism of geography or even sociology for that matter, or is that, oh, it's lacking in a particular theory, or it's not providing generalizable propositions that can be tested from one location to the next. What would you respond to that? Like, how do you
Yeah,
do
I mean,
theory, if you like?
yeah, I mean, I think theory looks different in, say, geography and sociology than it does certainly in kind of orthodox
Mm-hmm.
economics. And my sense is that um, is that geography and sociology would often be considered a-theoretical, in at least in part, not because there is no theory, but because that theory comes in a different form than mainstream economic theory. But the theory does exist. It's very, very plural,
Mm-hmm.
and I think often it insofar as sometimes it doesn't necessarily aspire to the same level of generalize generalizability and the same level of explanatory ambition as mainstream theory, then it becomes easier for it to be kind of poo-pooed
Mm-hmm.
by the mainstream, I think. But the theory does exist, and I think that there's plenty of scholars who have worked within geography who have made very compelling arguments that you that even as geography is interested in things like local specificity, that those are things that you can generalize about. I'm thinking about the work of people like Doreen Massey, David
Right.
Harvey, and others, where there's a great level of theoretical ambition, but without losing sight of the importance of localities and so
Right.
on.
So,
But that's a minefield of
right.
the question of kind of what constitutes theory and how we should
Mm-hmm.
understand theory per se is a difficult one.
Right. So I'm sitting in Panmure House. Behind me, for those that are listening and not watching the video recording, I have a portrait of Adam Smith sitting in his last home. And in your most recent book, and obviously in your other books that you've written, you do make reference to, let's say, classical economics or classical political economy. In your most latest book, you do mention Adam Smith. There's more of a Marxian tinge to the book, but you also refer to David Ricardo, and we'll come back to your references to these particular scholars. But going to this question of when I read Adam Smith, or when I read Karl Marx, or even other classical political economists, there's always a narrative. There's always a story. If you read The Wealth of Nations, it's kind of rich in description and explanation of the world as and historical development as Adam Smith viewed it and studied it through the 3,000 plus books that he had in his house. And I'm curious, how does classical political economy, and by that I mean what happened 200 and 250 years ago, how does it influence your thinking today, and what can it tell us? How can we use it and mobilize it for the economy or economics broadly defined in the 21st century?
Wow, that's
Big question.
another tough one. I mean, I think I would answer that in two different ways, or at least with two different thoughts. So I think the first thing I would say is that personally speaking, as as I've increasingly tried to write stuff that will be of interest to, and hopefully deemed reasonably lively writing by people working outside the academy, so non-scholarly audiences. I think that the role of theory and of classical economic theory in what I do has become a lot more implicit rather than explicit. So it's there these days more as kind of a guiding influence and a kind of conceptual framing, rather than something that I kind of shoehorn into the text as a kind of explicit explanatory device. So that's one point, which is to say that it's not there in writing very much explicit, but it's kind of there in the background, kind of hovering over everything I do. I think the second thing is that, that type of economic thinking, and you can, there are definitely people working in that tradition now as well. And I'm thinking about another of your guests, Branko Milanovic, who in many ways also works in this tradition. There are people working in that tradition where there is a narrative and there is a story and there is a kind of explanatory scope and ambition that appeals to me. But also I think that there's the Smiths of the world were interested in these big questions. There's this great, I'm sure you've read it, there's this great letter that Joan Robinson once wrote. I can't remember what the title of the letter was. It was something like A Letter to a Marxist or something. And she had this really nice way of kind of a potted history of economics, where she basically said, for Marx and Ricardo Smith, there were these big questions about total output and how it's distributed between wages and rent and profit and so on. And then along came Alfred Marshall and kind of turned it into a small question. I think as she said it, as she put it, the question that Marshall, as he had it, was like, why does an egg cost more than a cup of tea? It became very focused on the kind of theory of relative pricing, which was not necessarily an easy question, but it was a different type of question. And then along came Keynes, and he kind of returned to the big questions again. And from my perspective, the appeal of classical economics was explicitly that interest in big questions, as well as the telling of stories and the development of narratives. And the role of historical explanation in those stories.
And what would you say that modern economics, and I would include modern political economy of the more, let's say, critical variants, what do they get wrong about classical economics or classical political economy? If they get anything wrong, I mean, what's...
No, I mean, that's a good question to which I personally don't necessarily have a particularly good answer. And what I mean by that is that I'm no expert on contemporary economics. The last thing I want to do, or that I think is useful, is kind of blanket stereotypes about contemporary neoclassical economics, which I think are deeply unhelpful, and that's not something that I want to do, or that I have enough knowledge to do. So from my perspective, there's nothing, there's not necessarily anything inherently wrong with modern economics. What does it get wrong about classical economics? My one answer to that would be that it doesn't talk about it. And what I mean by that is simply that there's this kind of seems to be this kind of institutional forgetting within the discipline, where the history of economic ideas doesn't seem to be as important as I at least would expect it to be. I remember Ed Glazer, who I'm sure is someone that lots of your listeners will have heard of him. He came to Uppsala, where I work, a few years ago, and gave a talk. And I remember sitting next to him at dinner and talking to him, and he's obviously at Harvard, or at least was at the time. I think he's still there. And I remember saying, well, don't you think it's important that people studying economics at Harvard sort of have this understanding of the history of economic ideas? and come to appreciate why today's orthodoxy is today's orthodoxy, and what sorts of intellectual battles have been waged and won historically in order to develop that current orthodoxy. And I went on and on and on, and then I stopped, and he kind of looked at me and said, "No." And that was it. That was the end of the conversation. And it was
history doesn't matter.
No, because it's like this Whiggish understanding of history, right? Which is that what we've arrived at today is the orthodoxy because it's progress with a capital P. And so to me, it's like, what's wrong is just this historical forgetting.
I find that,
the last thing I want to do is say that there's inherent problems with the discipline. But it seems to me, so I work at an interdisciplinary institute in Uppsala with mainstream economists as colleagues, and I like the work they do. But it's just I don't find the work that they're doing to be the type of understanding of the economy that I strive after. They work with big data sets these days. It's become a very empirical discipline, my understanding. Yeah. And what they seem to do is try to find interesting patterns in the data and then try to use various statistical techniques to tease out some kind of causal relationship. And it's like, well, I'd rather get my hands dirty trying to actually go out into the real world and understand real world. It's not like they're not interested in the real world, but they're interested in those data sets, which I think can show interesting patterns. But I'm not sure that it can go so much further than that. And so to me, it's just a different, it's not worse, or it's just a different intellectual endeavor. That's the way I would put it.
But I find that to be sad almost. I think if you're going to be a researcher, an academic, don't you do that because you're intellectually curious and you want to know, you want to have an understanding? Because, I think I have a lot of time for all types of methodologies and perspectives. I take a very kind of Catholic view of, if someone wants to do this kind of, research design and crunch some big data sets, fantastic, find really interesting patterns. That's because, like you said, they can find interesting things, but you also need something else, right? There's another story to be told. And I think it's this sense of, well, if Adam Smith is notionally the father of economics and you don't know you've never read The Wealth of Nations beyond, someone mentioned specialization in the pen factory in your Econ 101 course, how can you then call him the father of economics? And I'm just picking on Smith because there's a portrait of behind him, but it goes to even to Keynes, to even Alfred Marshall, right? So going back in time, or Hayek or Schumpeter, shouldn't they be reading these ideas because there's a bigger story and there's a bigger picture to be had? And I find for Ed Glazer to say no, I just think, to me, that's almost illiberal. And the point of like a liberal education is that you study and you read widely, right? So that you don't have to, you don't have to be an expert in Adam Smith or Karl Marx or John Maynard Keynes, but shouldn't it be kind of part of any economics or social sciences kind of degree for that matter, to have some sense of where these ideas have come from, the ebbs and the flows. Before we talk a bit about your book, I want to be fair to the modern, let's say, mainstream economist. Do you think there's anything wrong with how modern critical political economy gets, or is there anything wrong with modern critical political economy that they get wrong about classical political economy, or the canon, if you like? That's a hard question too. Because
it is, but partly because I'll confess that I'm not 100% sure what you mean by modern critical political economy.
Right.
So what do you have in mind there?
Let's say academics who claim to be scholar activists, those that put particular thinkers on a pedestal like Karl Marx.
Okay. That's, in a sense, that's kind of my intellectual heritage, I suppose, to a significant extent. Yep. I mean, I write and have always written in that tradition to a significant extent.
Mhm.
In a sense, going back to something I said earlier, in a sense, I think I still do, although the theory is as I say, is kind of implicit rather than explicit.
Mhm.
I mean, I think, this is going to be a completely unsatisfactory answer, but I think personally, I have gotten. I find, how can I best put this? So I find two things to be not necessarily problematic, but things that I have found less and less interesting over time. So
Right.
the first would be that I think that there still tends to be a lot of discussion and debate, which I find increasingly kind of just esoteric around kind of what did or didn't Marx mean on this
Right.
particular question or that particular question. How might we read his arguments about the tendency for the rate of profit to fall? Was it something that he considered a law or a tendency, and how important were the counter tendencies? And it's like, dude,
Who cares?
I'm not in. Yeah, I'm really, frankly,
Yeah.
I hate to say it, I'm kind of not interested.
Yeah.
Secondly, I do tend to find that, I think we all as academics, certainly within kind of economic geography, we like to tell ourselves, and indeed often tell others, that our work is this kind of mix of both empirical substance and theoretical inspiration, theoretical deliberation, and that what we're trying to do is a kind of a perfect mix of theory and empirics,
Mhm.
kind of, and that's the story we kind of tell. My sense is that it's almost impossible to have that kind of perfect mix. It doesn't really exist, and so in reality, I think that work within scholarly work, certainly within economic geography, and I would say critical political economy, where there's a lot of overlap there, tends to be one more than the other, and I think where it tends to be kind of theory heavy, what I tend to find is that often I read that work and I think there's more interest apparent in that work in the theory than there is in the understanding the empirical reality of the world.
Right.
And it becomes a case of using empirical reality to sort of quote unquote substantiate the theoretical argument. So you might have a theoretical argument going back to about the tendency for the rate of profit to fall,
Right.
and you'll develop a narrative about kind of modern secular stagnation, and it so often reads to me more as a means to an end, where the end is kind of proving the theory right again, rather than actually learn anything particularly new about contemporary economic reality. And for better or worse, I've just kind of gone away from that direction, and I'm much more interested in the empirics now. I'm kind of, I've become more of a kind of, maybe empiricist is the wrong word, but I directly mobilizing theory to help me understand the empirical reality is something I find less and less useful now. And so if I have an argument there or a view there, it's simply that, personally, I find the kind of theory and empirics balance to be lopsided. It becomes about using empirics to kind of prove the theory rather than the other way around.
And would you say, I mean, my perception of a lot of that critical work is it's becoming increasingly speculative. So it's kind of imagining post-capitalist futures. It's imagining degrowth. And I mean, they'll couch it as being, no, it becomes like a political project rather than a retrospective. This is where we got to where we are. Or maybe I might not being fair.
Yeah, I don't know about that. I don't have a view on. I mean, if it's a political project, that's fine. I think. Certainly my work is at least in part a political project. Even if in my own work, I definitely try to keep my kind of normative position out of as best I can, out of the kind of analytical work that I do, although that's never entirely possible.
Right.
But certainly it's there informing the types of questions I ask and informing how I interpret the analytical answers I come up with. So if you know, I have no problem with that kind of political project. But again, I think this comes, in my view, this, you know, I think what you're getting at comes back a little bit to kind of cleaving to a particular kind of theoretical framework that is at once also a political framework, and sort of using the empirics as kind of vignettes to sort of substantiate that theory. And so often the empirics that become, in my view, not particularly deeply interrogated. They become, you know, a relatively small part of the package, when to me it should be the bigger part of the package.
Right. So on that note, let's talk about your new book. Right. The Price is Wrong: Why Capitalism Won't Save the Planet. And I think it's a fantastic title, The Price is Wrong, and partly because every time I see it, I think of The Price is Right game show that I grew up when. I remember, I know this is kind of off-piste here, but I first time I saw the title, The Price is Wrong, I was like, oh, it's a good title. And then I just can't keep thinking about Bob Barker from The Price is Right. You know, for the Americans listening, and Bob Barker was the host of The Price is Right for a long time. And I remember being, you know, when I was homesick from school on occasion, you know, it was like, watch Price is Right, you know, where people guess like the price of consumer goods. And, you know, so anyways, that's not what we're here to talk about. We're talking about the Price is Wrong: Why Capitalism Won't Save the Planet, which is, and we'll come back to the subtitle because I think it's a quite powerful statement, the subtitle. But let's talk about why the price is wrong. I mean, tell us a bit about that book. What is it? It's coming out very shortly. We're recording this at the end of February, and it's due to come out in February. So
yep,
and it
is very end of February.
Yeah.
So in a way, I think that I'll talk about this in a way that will bring me back to the main title, rather than starting with the main title. So the basic argument of the book is actually really, really straightforward one.
Right.
The analysis underlying the argument, I think, is quite. There's a lot there. It's quite, parts of it are quite dense, and it's dense for a good reason, which is that the book is about electricity for the most part, and it's about finance, and both of them are very complicated. Particularly electricity. Actually, I used to work more. You know, I used to do a lot of work on finance, and I used to think finance was complicated. And still, I started studying electricity, and I was like, "Shit, electricity is even more complicated than finance."
Yeah.
You know, because it has all the engineering aspects of it that you actually have to understand in order to understand the economics.
Right.
The two are sort of so thoroughly intertwined. But the basic argument of the book is a really simple one, which is that the business of renewables, by which I mean the business of developing and then owning and operating solar and wind facilities and selling the electricity that they produce, that business is actually just not a very good business. It's kind of a shitty business. It's kind of not a very good business on the terms that are most important, which is in terms of profitability.
Right.
The profitability of that business is you know, goes up in time, down over time. It varies from place to place, all sorts of other variants. But in general, it's not a very profitable business. Now, why is that a problem? That is a problem for two connected reasons. The first is that the world has essentially bet the house on renewables. So, and what I mean by that is lots of different things. So, in terms of mitigating the pace and scale of climate change, in terms of trying to limit the temperature rises above pre-industrial levels, the main strategy that the world has is wind and solar power. So you do two things. You electrify as much as you can. So you electrify road transportation, you electrify industrial processes, you electrify buildings and their heating and lighting. You electrify as much as you can, and then you develop that electricity in a carbon-free way through renewables. Yes, you have some nuclear power. You need nuclear or hydro, but typically nuclear, to provide this kind of base load level of power that you can always rely on when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining. But you push solar and wind. That's the core of the world's strategy for climate change mitigation. You read the IEA, the International Energy Agency, you read the IPCC reports, and there's no significant dissensus on that. So the world is essentially betting the house on wind and solar, and the world is essentially betting the house on the private sector and markets delivering that. Does that mean that the governments have no role to play? No, of course not. But it does mean that government's role in most parts of the world, China would be the main and most important exception to this, but in most parts of the world, the strategy is essentially we, governments, are relying on you, private companies, to develop the new solar and wind farms, to own them and to operate in them and to sell the power.
Right.
Now, that's a problem if the business is not a particularly attractive business. And that's the basic argument of the book, is that profitability constraint is exceedingly problematic if, as is the case, we're relying on the private sector to decarbonize power generation, but the private sector doesn't necessarily see that as a particularly appetizing prospect. And that's the basic argument of the book. Now, to get to the title of the book, where that comes in, is that the argument I'm making is an attempt to shift the debate about the economics of decarbonisation.
Right.
By which I mean that debate has always been, and still for the most part is, a debate not about profit, but about price. And so the argument there has always been, if you go back 15 years or so or more, the price or the cost of generating electricity through solar and wind facilities, it was much, much more expensive than generating electricity through natural gas, or in particular coal. Way more expensive.
And that was a function of the technology and the cost of it.
Was a fact they were immature technologies. They hadn't been developed at scale. China hadn't kind of really got stuck in yet at that point, which it subsequently did. So it was very expensive. So the argument that economists and policymakers made, which was right, was we need to provide subsidies of various kinds to help them out because they're more expensive. So without those supports, they'll never get developed because they're too expensive. But the other part of the argument is that once those technologies have been developed and invested in and produced at scale, the costs will come down. And once the costs have come down to kind of parity with fossil fuel fired power, then the economic obstacles to decarbonisation have been removed. We've solved the problem. The economics have been resolved. We can remove all the subsidies and supports, and renewables will then kind of charge ahead on their own merits because they're cheaper. And at that point, if we're still struggling with decarbonisation, it's not because of the economics. It's because of politics and policy and things like, I talk about this in the book, things like planning constraints. Mm-hmm. So if wind and solar are developing too slowly, and it's nothing to do with economics, it's because of bureaucratic thickets getting in the way. Too long for grid connection, too long to get planning permission, those sorts of things. Now, what my book is arguing is two things. One is I'm not saying that those other obstacles don't exist. Of course they exist. Yeah, absolutely they exist to varying degrees in different countries. But the main argument is the economics is still a problem. Right. Even though you have reached parity or better on generating cost, there are still huge economic obstacles, and that obstacle is about profitability. Simply put, for most of those companies that do or might be interested in developing wind or solar power, it's just not a very attractive proposition in profitability terms, even though everywhere in the world, A, the costs have come down, the generating costs have come down, and B, everywhere in the world, governments continue to support renewables through subsidy and other kinds of support mechanisms. And so the book is about trying to explain why that is the case, as well as why it's problematic.
Right. And you see that, I mean, just for example, in the Netherlands, which has had really massive solar development in the last couple of years, but it's only because of a specific deal that the government is effectively putting on the electric providers to subsidize. Basically, if you have solar panels on your roof, what you put into the grid, you get back out, right? So on a summer day, you have 8 solar panels, you put in 10 kilowatts, you get that back on a dark winter day where you maybe are lucky and you produce, 2 kilowatt hours, right? But you pay the same price for it. But that only works because of that particular regulation that the providers, the grid companies are saying, well, we're subsidizing, this doesn't make sense for us. And they were going to change that rule. The Parliament wanted to change, the House wanted to change, House of the second chamber, the main chamber of the Dutch Parliament wanted to change it, and the government wanted to change it. But then the Senate said, no, we're not going to do it. And the reason why the government wanted to do it was because they always looked at it as a subsidy for basically well-to-do households that can afford them, sure. and big installation, big people that had buildings that could put them on there. But the argument that came through from the Senate is like, no. This is not the time to stop subsidizing it, because the price of solar has become so cheap that now it's cheaper for lower income households to afford the solar panels. So maybe they're right about that, but it's still, so the price is still there, but that profit motive is still, that profitability aspect is there even for the people that are installing it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And even on the perspective of the regulations, there was in the Financial Times today a bigger piece on onshore wind in Spain, and you have these, which is another interesting thing. They're talking about these wind farms that now are, the technology is, they're too small and they're at the end of their life. They're 30 years old, which is another story that's not often discussed, right? That
almost never. Wind farms, it's good to see that FT piece.
Yeah, so that there's always, even in this technology, we might think, oh, it's free energy for forever. It's like, well, actually, no, because you have to replace these after 25, 30. I mean, if you're lucky, I guess 40 years.
Sooner than they last, their lives are shorter than fossil conventional power plants.
Right. Absolutely. So this is where, the that comes into the profitability aspect. And that's why, but it's interesting because you're right. I mean, that's when I was reading your book and reflecting on how, all you hear is the price aspect, right? And people go out there like, look how cheap it is. It's all
price. Totally the wrong way of looking at it. Now, what I'm not saying is that price is irrelevant. Of course,
right?
The cost of generating the electricity over the life of the plant, whether it's a conventional plant or a solar or wind farm, of course, that is one of the factors that shapes profitability.
Right.
But it's not the only factor that shapes profitability. And by focusing on that in isolation, you're missing the most important dynamic, which is profitability, because it's profitability expectations that shape investment decisions, and it's investment that we care about here.
Yeah.
And as you'll know from reading book, one of the other arguments I make is that at the end of the day, it's actually not the developers that really are the key decision makers. It's the not surprisingly, this is capitalism we're talking about.
Yeah.
It's the financial institutions that stand behind them, because the key decision that ultimately makes the difference between a new renewables investment going ahead or not is the decision of the bank to lend the money for the construction of the facility in the first place. Because these facilities typically depend predominantly on debt financing. So it comes back at the end of the day to finance, and whether the lender thinks that there is a strong possibility of her loan being repaid over the duration of the facility of that solar or wind facility.
And as we're seeing,
but as you say, just in terms of the government support. What was interesting there is, as I said earlier, governments thought that when the prices came down, they could safely remove those subsidies. And that's what you saw in, the US is the best example of this.
Yeah.
They gradually diminished the level of support that is embedded in the tax credits they provide. But then investment began declining. And actually, where you look at places in the world where subsidies have been removed altogether, investment just completely collapses.
It dries up.
It disappears completely.
Right.
And so the way to think about those subsidies that governments provide to renewables around the world, I think the way I like to think about these, and I think people should think about them, is that what they're there for is essentially to try to keep the business just profitable enough to continue to incentivize investment. Because once you reduce those subsidies and profitability levels fall, that's when you get the problem with investment not happening.
And I'm wondering, well, I mean, one thing to say though is, going back to what we said earlier about classical economics, is that you're able to make that argument. And you refer to in the book, you mention Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and Karl Marx, all of whom recognized that profit was fundamental to how capital operated.
Yeah.
It's, full stop. Like that's where we start. That's the basis from it.
Yeah.
And, this is, and I'm not just trying to promote Adam Smith's Pan House, but part of my mandate is to remind people of Smith, but not simply Smith, but just thinking broadly and thinking back to, well, why were they thinking about this? But it's thinking about they thought, and I don't like to use the term holistically, but there was that sense. They did,
absolutely, yeah.
Right? They thought about the bigger picture.
Yeah, and also there's as you'll know who I'm talking about. There's the heterodox economist Anwar Sheikh in his massive book, his kind of opus that he wrote 5 or 6 years ago. He has this lovely kind of description for classical economics, the economics of Ricardo and Smith and Marx, where he calls it profit sidist. So it's not supply side or demand side economics; it's profit side economics, by which he meant that it's profit that drives capitalist economies. And to me, at any rate, that's the kind of one of the great beauties of that classical economic corpus, as varied as it was that it puts profitability right at the center of things. And when you, going back to when I as a consultant, when you work in the business, of course it is. It's and again, going back to what Joan Robinson wrote in that letter that I referred to, as she puts it, when you had the marginal revolution, when you had the neoclassical revolution at the end of the 19th century, it shifted the issue from these big questions around profit versus rent versus wages to this much smaller question about pricing. And Keynes kind of restored it to a big question, but in a different way.
Right.
And as she says in that letter, price levels are still relevant to those big questions, but they're not the main point. And I think that's where, in a sense, I would see one of the big differences between today's orthodox contemporary economics and classical economics is what the questions are. Is it about pricing or is it about profits? And as you say, yes, in the book I appeal to that classical economics precisely because of its centering of questions around profitability.
Right. And so then that leads me to the subtitle of your book, Why Capitalism Won't Save the Planet. And I'd like to discuss it partly because in reading your book, and we don't want to give too much away because we want people to go out and buy your book, is I don't find that you're necessarily making an, let's say, anti-capitalist argument. In that, the subtitle suggests, and perhaps it's a marketing type thing, but it suggests that, okay, because there are books out there that basically say capitalism is not what's going to save the planet, and we need a completely different system. We need to move to this radical degrowth system. We need to move to some form of kind of socialism where everything's planned, and that's kind of what's possibly suggestive of your subtitle,
right?
But I don't think that is actually the argument that you're making,
right? Yeah, good question or good point.
Good point.
I mean,
so
yeah.
What is? I guess maybe the way to put it is then what is anti-capitalist, if we can say that there's such a thing as anti-capitalist, or what? put it this way: I'm giving you the opportunity to appeal to the readers that aren't interested in reading the anti-capitalist take on what's wrong with capitalism. Because
no, I get that, and I appreciate it, and no, I mean, anyone expecting to read a book that is a kind of a rant is not, it's not that. To what extent? What do I mean by, what does the title mean by why capital won't save the rich? What it means is that if you take as read the idea that that capitalist development depends upon and is driven by attractive expectations around profitability, then that's a problem for the future of the planet, insofar as the most important activity to ecological health in the future is paradoxically perhaps not a particularly attractive one in profitability terms. But then you begin to get into all sorts of questions about, don't we have a capitalist system where the state plays always and everywhere plays a very significant role in fashioning profit expectations and possibilities anyway? And so I guess what I'm saying is pure capitalism can't save the planet. But can a capitalism where the state basically says we have a form of massive market failure here, and we are just going to do what is necessary to keep profits in the sector high enough to keep capital flowing in, then absolutely. I mean, as I see it, there are three broad kind of possibilities. So right now we're failing. Let's not be in any doubt about that. So the level of investment that has been and is continuing to occur in solar and wind is nothing close to. It's going up a lot, absolutely. Yeah. But it's still not close to where we need it to be to hit 2 degrees, let alone 1.5 degrees. So we're failing. How can we succeed? Well, we can't continue with the status quo. So what can we do? Well, one is exactly as I said, is for governments to say, okay, we're going to continue with a model that is led by the private sector and markets, but we're just going to chuck so much subsidy and support at it that capital will seize the day and do what's required, because we're making it so attractive for them to do that. They're going to de-risk, to use the language of the day, for all they're worth, and capital when they're doing. That's one answer. The second answer, and this is the answer that I think orthodox economists would provide and do provide. They do argue this. They would say, look, the problem is not markets and the problem is not that we're led by markets and private sector. The problem is that we've got the wrong type of market. So they would argue that the issue here is that the electricity sector, as it is constituted currently worldwide for the most part, is a sector that was designed in and for a world of fossil fuels. And we are now living in a different world where we have different types of electrical power with different types of engineering challenges, and we need to reconfigure markets. We need to redesign. It's an issue of market design, pure and simple. That is their argument, and they would say that. So the problem is, and it's the classic neoliberal argument, right? Which is that the answer to a problem kind of caused by markets is more markets or better markets. The problem is not the market per se; it's the particular type of market. So
they would look at the intermittency of wind and solar and say, well, we can solve that through a market of storage and loading into batteries, and that can manage the volatility, and then
exactly. Yeah. And you change the way in which electricity is priced, essentially, and the way in which it's bought and sold. So you tinker with market formations, market designs. And in such a way as to resolve those problems. I'm deeply skeptical of that. Besides the fact that those arguments continue to get ignored. So at the height of the energy crisis in 2021-22 in Europe, everyone agreed that we need to redesign markets. Everyone was up in arms. Why gas and electricity prices coupled in this strange way?
Right.
We need to decouple them. Everyone was saying that. Now that prices have returned to something closer to normality, all those calls have disappeared, and all of those calling for markets to be redesigned in the political class are basically saying, no, let's just leave them as they are. So it doesn't look like it's going to happen. I'm skeptical about what difference it would make even if it did happen. That's the second answer. The third answer, and I guess there's two parts to this. Is two different alternatives here, which is where you move away from capitalism. And going back to your question, and there the state, instead of subsidizing capital, does one of two different things. Either it says, okay, you're not doing this quickly enough, we're just going to make you do it. We're going to compel you to build more solar and wind farms, whether you like it or not. So
it's just an argument for public.
The analogy
utilities.
here would be, well, I'll come back to that in a second.
Okay.
But the best example here would be kind of a wartime analogy. So
right.
There's a long history in wartime of so-called compulsory production orders where private firms are forced by the government to do certain things as part of the war effort. Well, given that the great and the good continue to like to compare climate change as a war, then why aren't we doing things like we do in war? Tell capital what to do. Now, again, we're so far from that happening.
And even politically, I think it's...
Yeah. So we're so far, but that could be done. The other thing, and this is kind of the China answer, is that the state effectively does it itself through state-owned companies. So in China, China is, almost all the development of renewables facilities that is occurring in China these days is by state-owned companies, and almost all of that development is financed by state-owned banks. So it's essentially Beijing doing it itself. Does the profit motive play a part? Yes, but at the margins is my understanding of what's going on there. So it's basically the state doing it itself, overriding the profitability dynamic, and it should be noted here that if you look at data for wind and solar development in the last 2 or 3 years, it's only China that is showing significant increases in investment. So the one place in the world that isn't relying on capital and the profit motive is the one place that is showing significant growth. That's pretty significant.
Right. So I guess, so essentially, we'll come back to the China and the state-owned, but in effect, it's returning to a system of public utilities that provide essential infrastructure, and that essential infrastructure is clean power.
Absolutely.
And I guess the reason why I pushed you on whether your book is anti-capitalist, because even the father of economics or the father of capitalism, whose portrait is behind me, even though I would argue that Smith was writing in a pre-capitalist period, at least pre-industrial, he recognized in his system of natural liberty that, well, there's certain things that it makes sense that needs to be some kind of public monopoly or because it just doesn't make sense for individual capitalists, individual merchants and business people to run a particular, economic, a necessary economic thing that everyone benefits from, right? So that's why I say it's not necessarily an anti-capitalist argument, in that you can find, I would say, even classical liberal thinkers or more kind of market liberals that would say, okay, this makes sense because it's an essential, it's not reforming the system, and that there's the space for it. Because I think what I'm interested in is that, say you have that public utility, but then how do you then still mobilize the market forces that stimulate innovation in renewables and green tech and the like? Because this is where I think when I read arguments for, we need the state to kind of help us solve climate change. And I think, there's a lot of, there's arguments for really big capital investments and I would likely agree that some things it's going to take state involvement, but then but then on top of that, I think kind of some of those that will argue in that sense, they have no space for the market. They have no space for kind of the necessary innovations that we need across, so this, it's, the electricity problem is much bigger than than
It is.
the production
It is.
of it.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely, to go where you're absolutely right about Adam Smith. I mean, he saw it as infrastructure for him was a classic case of market failure, and so that's why the state needs to step in and provide those public works. I mean, yes and no to your question. So, you can look at these both theoretically and empirically. So, theoretically, someone like Mariana Mazzucato would say, the state is not necessarily a kind of a site of no innovation. The state can be entrepreneurial and things. So there's that argument. But then in practice, yes, there's been an enormous amount of innovation already in renewables technologies. But most of the significant developments have happened in China. It's China that has driven down the price of these technologies. It's China that dominates the supply of both wind and solar technologies worldwide, and that historical development has been driven by the state and by state-owned companies. But so I don't buy the argument that you need the market as separate from the state for that innovation to occur. And frankly, I think my view is that if Adam Smith kind of came, who knows? But my guess is that if he came back today and he saw what has happened to infrastructure ownership and management and the delivery of the services associated with those in, say, England and Wales over the last 30 or 40 years, he'd be horrified. He would come to exactly the same conclusion that essentially all the FT's writers have come to, as far as I can tell, which is that privatisation of electricity and water in the UK, in England and Wales has been an unmitigated disaster in every conceivable respect. The difference being that he would have told them beforehand that was what was going to happen, precisely because of the arguments that he set out in The Wealth of Nations. So I think that he would look at where we are today with energy, with renewables, with the challenges, and reiterate that argument of his about the importance of public works. But of course, today there's a huge political challenge associated with that, which is that the government would need to borrow to become a major investor in those types of infrastructures. Even though those are going to be revenue generating infrastructures, and even with a Labour government, the government is not willing to entertain that because it's politically cowardly.
But when I look at the development of state-owned enterprises, including in China, or state-owned investment funds, what's interesting about them, though, is that there's a perception, or at least empirically, we see that they're more marketized, right? And the way they operate and the management structures of these firms are often driven by market signals. In the Chinese case, it's a bit hard to tell, right? Because you don't always know. I mean, the signals coming from central government or provincial governments, it's not always clear, and there is guidance, and I think it's tied up, and but they still operate in an interesting, a more marketized, if you like, fashion. And so then I'm thinking, if we did have more state ownership in the liberal economies, and that includes, when I say liberal, I mean, basically most of Europe and the developed advanced economies, the likelihood is that such state ownership would still look like a private sector firm, but the state would just be the owner. And that's what we're seeing in a lot of these companies, is they're not the public utilities of 50 years ago. And so I'm kind of curious, if we think about your argument going forward as a particular option, notwithstanding the difficulties of getting it done politically, is that if it were to be done politically, the likelihood is that these companies would be set up and they would operate and look just like a private sector, but the state would be the owner. And then we probably wouldn't get the outcomes
Yeah.
You wouldn't get the outcomes that you would like.
Yeah. I mean, I'll go to answer that question. I'll go back to someone who I mentioned earlier. Probably my favorite geographer is the late Doreen Massey. So in the late 1970s, she did a lot of work that many people don't know about now. People tend to know her work that was done in the 80s and 90s more than in the 70s. But she did a huge amount of work on land ownership, and in particular on public land ownership. And this was at the time when the question of land ownership, in particular public land ownership, was still a much more kind of politically salient, politically visible question than it ever has been since. Mm-hmm. And one of the points she made about public land ownership, for which she was a great advocate, was there's no point in having public land ownership if public sector landowners are simply expected to operate like private sector landowners. Mm-hmm. So she said that the public ownership in and of itself doesn't really mean anything if the owner is not allowed to and enabled and encouraged to operate in a different way, which I think is what you're getting at, right?
Yeah.
Which is and I think she was completely right about that. And I think the same would be true today, which is so Labour in the UK, for example, have been talking about putting a little bit of money into producing a new energy generating company, renewable energy generating company called Great British Energy. Mm-hmm. To which my response will be, first of all, it's the scale on which they imagine it is too small to have any significance at all, on my understanding. But second of all, is that my impression from listening to discussion around it is that it would fall foul of that outcome, where it would be expected to behave just like a private sector, and then it's like, well, what's the point? There is very, very little point of that. So again, I think that if you have public sector ownership of energy, but in a fully kind of marketized way, there isn't much point to that. Whereas I think what's going on in China, yes, there are certain market signals there, but my impression is that when it comes to new investment, at least, those market signals are not predominant. I think they are undertaking massive investment in new renewables, not because the market is telling them to, but because Beijing is telling them to. So,
and they're also building lots of coal-fired power plants as well.
They are, absolutely they are. Yeah, I mean, and there's enormous contradictions and paradoxes and so on there. But the point is that unless you have public sector ownership with political fashioning of what's going on there and political decision making guided by principles that are not just based upon market and price signals, then I don't really see the point. Right. Which is not to say we need global governments that mirror the Chinese government, but China's doing something interesting there that we shouldn't ignore.
Right. I mean, there's also here in the UK, there's talk of setting up a new British sovereign wealth fund, and I do research on sovereign funds, but I'm very skeptical and critical of this development, partly because I think, well, wait a minute, you have the deepest capital markets in the world, and the things you want to do with this British sovereign wealth fund, I think, well, what's the point of Parliament? And you see this in a lot of countries that they want to set up a sovereign fund. I think it's great if you need to manage something, or you want a particular, you don't have a private equity or venture capital sector, and so you want to kind of spur that development. That's fine. But then a lot of times you think, well, no, there's a lot of these things that can be fixed via the regular operations of parliamentary systems and democratic governance. Of if you want to fix education, well, maybe it's probably best to look at how you support education. If you want to look at healthcare, and that's not an argument to say public provision of everything, right? It's that the sense of, I feel like there's this let's say finance fetish, if you like, or a corporate fetish where, and I think you can say this if you're kind of generally pro-market liberal, in the sense that there's still that fetish of, the solutions need to be driven by finance, when sometimes it's like, no, let capital do what capital does. Yeah. Let the state do what the state does. and let's not mix them. And if we are going to have the state do things, do something that, the private sector can't do or won't do, right? So you don't need to, particularly in a place like London, set up a state investment bank, because you think, well, you have one of the deepest capital markets in the world, and you have financiers who know how to look at, business plans. They know how, they will capital move to things that are profitable. So if it goes back to, Doreen Massey argument, it's like, well, if you're going to have public land or public something, have it do something different. And I think that's something.
No, absolutely. Yeah.
So we've gone over longer than I wanted to, but and we could probably continue for a long time. I wanted to just finish with a harder question is, what's your prediction for decarbonization?
Yeah, that's a hard question. And unfortunately, my prediction, to the extent that I have one, is not really a rosy one. I think that, and I say that, I guess, less because of the slow pace of renewables development in most countries, although I think that's obviously a big part of the reason. But actually, the thing that I've been most struck by in the last few years is that it feels to me like on the other side of the fence, on the fossil fuel side, that there's been a kind of a backtracking or a kind of regression on that front, where a few years ago it felt like at least some of the big fossil fuel companies were at least talking a good game on decarbonisation. Feels like it's like a lot of them have almost kind of given up even pretending. Take an example, like, I don't know about you, but I used to read years ago, 5, 6, 7 years ago, I used to read a lot of stuff about stranded assets, about this idea that fossil fuel companies were going to stop investing because of a worry that any newly developed assets would be stranded in 20 years' time, by which was meant that they wouldn't be able to sell or exploit those resources because there would be no market for them. Well, I don't know about you, but I don't hear much about stranded assets anymore. I mean, because it's become blatantly clear that two things, that A, in 30 years' time, they'll still be selling a shitload of oil and gas. And B, more importantly yet, that they are investing precisely on that assumption. So it seems to me that with all the new oil and gas exploitation going on, that's a pretty clear sign to me. They wouldn't say it, but I think that the big oil and gas companies, let alone the state-owned, oil and gas companies in other parts of the world, I think they are basically, my impression is that they are investing on the expectation of a 3 degrees world, not a 2 degrees world. That's what they're. They wouldn't say that, but I bet you that their internal, my expectation, would be that that's what their internal models are based upon. They think that's what's going to happen, and they're investing on that basis.
I always thought, I never quite bought the stranded asset argument, and it always, to me, it felt like the peak oil argument. If you remember that, there was that argument.
Yeah, of course. We've reached. To remember that one.
Yeah,
as well.
We've reached peak. We're going to reach peak oil, and then all of a sudden, fracking comes along. It's like, no, or deep sea kind of. It's like there's plenty of there's way more oil than in gas, and we can find more. And I have felt that a bit with stranded assets, that it's not going to be, these corporations, these big, and state oil companies, they're just going to follow market demand, and energy growth and energy demand continues to increase at a pace that renewables can't keep up with. Building nuclear doesn't happen fast enough, and is constrained. And so everyone's looking and think, well, and politicians are also looking at, people don't want to pay, people need energy. And that's, I think, the calculus that they made. And we can hope that there is going to be rapid technological solutions, but
I think that my sense, and I definitely get this sense from people talking to people who know more about this particular aspect than me, is that that's the hope now. Is that technology will save the day?
Yeah.
And look at like the IPCC's forecast that it's produced. Every time it produces them, it's kind of scenarios for what's going to happen. The crutch of negative emissions technology, so carbon capture and storage, the assumptions around that get bigger every time. So every time it has its scenarios, it's more and more placing an expectation upon a technology that we don't have yet delivering at scale. And so I think that will continue. We'll become more and more dependent upon hope rather than expectation over what different, and eventually it will end up with climate engineering.
But we shouldn't. I mean, but this is the thing: is I wouldn't. I mean, I'm not a kind of techno optimist per se, but I don't underestimate that innovations can come and scale really quickly.
Nor do I, but we shouldn't plan on the basis that they will.
Right. I think the potential's there, and that's Yeah. I mean, you see it, and there's interesting research happening on carbon capture and storage. I mean, it's something that I keep talking. It's carbon capture and storage is a bit like nuclear fusion. It's always like 20 years or 10 years, and then you start realizing, the frustration is that once you see and I've got this new technology and I don't, but I've talked to people that are working on, and they're doing interesting things, but I think more likely it's natural capital sinks or natural carbon sinks that we're going to have to rely on. But who knows? I guess we'll end on a fairly pessimistic but somewhat optimistic view, maybe. But Brett Christophers, thank you so much for being on the New Enlightenment podcast. And
thank you very much for having me.
We'll put
very much appreciate it.
A link to your book in the show notes so that everyone can buy it and read it and give it as a gift at Christmas. Brett's an excellent writer and a good storyteller. And so thank you very much, Brett.
Thanks for having me.